The Last of Us is among my favourite games of all time, and upon completing it back in 2013, I was unsure if I ever wanted a sequel to it, as the original game ended on such a powerful note. However, whilst watching the 2016 PSX showcase, I was undeniably filled with excitement by the confirmation of a sequel. I knew that if Naughty Dog were going to make a sequel, they definitely had a story worth telling. After all, they're easily one of the best studios in the games industry. Now, after finishing The Last of Us Part 2 twice and getting the Platinum Trophy, I know I was right to have full faith in Naughty Dog. The Last of Us Part 2 offers an even more impactful, tragic, and harrowing story than the one found in the first game, as well as refined gameplay and an unparalleled degree of polish. With The Last of Us Part 2, Naughty Dog have done something nearly impossible. They've created a game that surpasses its already sublime predecessor in practically every way. The Last of Us Part 2 is a game unlike anything else I've ever played. It challenged me in ways that I've never been challenged by a video game. It's a heartbreaking cautionary tale of the toll hatred and the desire for revenge take on a person and the people around them. It put me in difficult situations where I felt uncomfortable with the actions of Ellie, even if I could completely understand why she was making the decisions she was. There were moments in the game where I genuinely felt remorse for the heinous acts of violence I committed as Ellie. It's this moral complexity and bold unapologetic use of graphic violence that separates The Last of Us Part 2's story from the vast majority of video game stories. The story masterfully juxtaposes love and hatred and tastefully explores themes of grief and PTSD. As the story progresses, the sense of tension in the game rises further and further. Never has a game put me on edge as much as The Last of Us Part 2 did. The Last of Us Part 2 is arguably now my favourite video game story of all time. The impeccable acting played a large role in making The Last of Us such a special game. In Part 2, the acting remains a highlight. Ashley Johnson and Troy Baker remain incredible as Ellie and Joel, but the cast of characters is also heavily expanded in Part 2. The highlights for me were Laura Bailey and Shannon Woodward, who give phenomenal performances as newcomers Abby and Dina. There were plenty of other standout characters throughout the course of the game, with Yara, Lev and Jesse also being new characters I really liked. There is an unprecedented level of complexity to the characters of The Last of Us Part 2 that kept my opinions of the cast constantly shifting over the 25 hours it took me to finish the game. Environmental storytelling also plays a large part in adding to the already rich narrative. Notes scattered across the environment tell the stories of countless different people within this unforgiving world. Some tie into the main storyline of the game, while others simply tell small, contained stories of their own. These notes are always worth reading because they both help to expand the universe of The Last of Us in meaningful ways, and sometimes offer gameplay incentives. For example, through reading a note, you might find a combination for a safe filled with useful supplies. The original Last of Us is a great example of music being used to elevate a scene to another level. It had one of the best and most memorable scores in gaming. Thankfully, the acclaimed composer of the original game, Gustavo Santaolalla, returned to create the score for Part 2, and he delivered another wonderful soundtrack. It's a score that's subtle enough to not overshadow what's happening on screen, or still adding extra emotional weight to scenes. But the score isn't the only effective use of sound in The Last of Us Part 2. The sound design all around is flawless, and is used perfectly to constantly keep tensions high. The most meaningful way the game plays with music isn't in the form of the score though, it's the use of Ellie playing guitar. As the first teaser showcased, Ellie's guitar plays a fairly significant role in the story. There are moments where you'll play the guitar as Ellie, using the PS4's touchpad, and while this could have easily been gimmicky, it totally works, and leads to some wonderful and emotional moments in the story. The gameplay has also drastically evolved in The Last of Us Part 2. Character movement is far more fluid than it was in the first game. Ellie controls completely different than Joel did in Part 1, which makes sense as Ellie is significantly younger. You have several abilities in Part 2 that weren't present in the first game, such as dedicated jump and dodge buttons, and the ability to go prone at any time. This means you have a lot more ways you can traverse the environment and approach combat. The combat in The Last of Us Part 2 is excellent. There's a large variety of weapons, both ranged and melee, and each weapon has a distinct feel. The combat feels varied, and each encounter can be approached in a variety of ways. You can stealthily pick off enemies with a bow, plant traps around the environment, or charge in lobbing molotovs and blasting enemies with a shotgun. All of these are completely viable options in The Last of Us Part 2, and it's this freedom in the combat that prevents encounters from ever getting stale. The biggest improvement between the original game and Part 2 for me was the encounter design. The areas in which you encounter enemies are impeccably well designed. They're noticeably bigger than the environments of the first game, and far more detailed as well, with countless nooks and crannies that can be used to your advantage both when sneaking up on or trying to escape enemies. The way The Last of Us Part 2 utilises violence as part of its gameplay is unlike anything I've seen before. Its violence is so extreme it makes you as the player question your actions. Not only is the act of killing an enemy in the game confronting due to the visceral and gory nature of the violence, enemies will also scream in agony, and seemingly every human enemy is named, meaning enemies will cry out with the name of the person Ellie has killed if they see them die or find their body. Something that you'll now have to account for when dealing with enemies is that they'll regularly have dogs with them. Dogs can track Ellie's scent, forcing you to stay mobile when they are present. While the first game's iconic clickers and bloaters return, there are also a handful of new infected enemy types in The Last of Us Part 2 that force you to approach situations more cautiously than you would with runners or clickers. I won't dive too deep into them so as to avoid spoiling anything, but I really appreciated the way these new infected mixed up combat scenarios. Just like there was in the first game, there's an element of character progression thanks to the inclusion of upgradable skill trees and weapons, though these have been significantly expanded on from the first game, with far more options to unlock. Through finding supplements in the environment, you can upgrade skill trees that give you perks, and through collecting scrap, you can enhance your weapons at workbenches. When you enhance a weapon, Ellie will actually disassemble the weapon, make modifications and attach new parts, which can be seen on the weapon. It's the attention to detail in things like this that set Naughty Dog apart from other studios. Naughty Dog have consistently set the bar for graphics over the last two console generations, with both the Uncharted games and the first Last of Us. And The Last of Us Part 2 is no exception. This is one of the best looking games ever made. The motion capture technology used here is mind-blowing and brings the characters to life in such an impressive way. The attention to detail in both the character models and the environments is unparalleled. I don't think I've ever spent so much time in a game's photo mode. The breathtaking environments and beautiful lighting in The Last of Us Part 2 made me want to capture countless moments of my journey. The Last of Us Part 2 is a game filled with bold decisions that isn't afraid to challenge the player's perception of right and wrong at every turn. It's arguably the most morally ambiguous story I've ever seen told in a game, and its gut-wrenching story of revenge and hatred is something I will never forget. The Last of Us Part 2 is the kind of game you only see a few times a generation.
What?